Good morning. It is 6 o'clock in the morning here on Panama City Beach. Up above me you can see a full moon over the ocean. It's pretty fantastic and gorgeous, and I'm here to talk to you about paradise. So Dante's Paradiso is the third part of the Divine Comedy, starting with the Inferno, moving on to Purgatorio, and finally Paradiso. These three sections make up the whole of Dante's journey through the afterlife. He starts by going down into the underworld in Inferno, moving on to the mountain of Purgatorio on the other side of the world, and finally ascending into heaven at the beginning of Paradiso. And in Paradiso, he's going to see all the blessed souls, those souls who are not suffering any punishment, but are receiving their reward for a job well done in life. It's where all the souls in Purgatory are aiming towards, and where all of them are heading, but all the souls in Inferno are rejecting. So, Paradiso is, as I said, the third part of Dante's Divine Comedy, and it mirrors the other two parts. Just like the other two parts, it's got 33 cantos. Of course, there is the 34 in Inferno, but we sort of count the first one as an introduction. So it is the last set of 100 cantos. And as I've mentioned at the beginning of my notes over Purgatorio and Inferno, it also mirrors what happens in each of the other sections. So if you read them side by side instead of straight through, you'd see significant comparisons between each canto within each of the three sections. And though this is a new book, I'm still continuing my ideas and thoughts from Purgatorio, and I'm still addressing all of this to Harrison, who's one of my former students who is currently reading the Divine Comedy, and we're chatting about it as we go along. I'm a little bit behind, but I'm trying to get caught up. And if you're interested in my translation, right now I'm using John Chardy, who's really fantastic. He also has great notes. I do compare his text with a whole lot of other translations. I've got about 6 translations of Paradiso, and I really like to do a little bit of comparison in the text. But generally, if you just pick one, Chardy's excellent. So today, as the sun rises in front of me and the full moon is behind me over the ocean, I would like to start with the first 5 cantos of Inferno, which deal, of course, with symbolism with the sun and the moon. If you remember from Inferno and Purgatorio, each of his main sections begins with an invocation, a call out to usually the muse to inspire him and help him with his song, with singing the story of the afterlife. And I call it a song because that's really what Dante calls it as well. He calls each of the sections cantos, which means songs, and the overall section, either Inferno, Purgatorio, or Paradiso, a canticle. And we're going to have something to comment on when we reach the word song here shortly. So, in like way, Dante begins Paradiso with an invocation, and this time he invokes all of the muses and also Apollo, and says that he's going to need more than he's ever needed before, because now he's describing something even more intense and even more amazing than anything that he described previously. "O good Apollo, for this task I pray, you make me such a vassal for your powers, as you deem worthy to be crowned with bay. One peak of cleft Parnassus heretofore has served my need, now I must summon both on entering the arena one time more." And once again, there's that call out to a divine power, which is so important to the overall Divine Comedy, the need for divine assistance on one's journey and in one's poetry. But there's also that second layer that we often see with Dante, where he seems to be very interested in taking credit. There's that pride aspect. Listen to how he continues. He says, "O power divine, but lend to my high strain so much as will make clear even the shadow of that high kingdom stamped upon my brain, and you shall see me come to your dear grove to crown myself with those green leaves which you and my high theme shall make me worthy of. So seldom are they gathered, holy sire, to crown an emperor's or a poet's triumph, O fault and shame of mortal man's desire, that the glad Delphic god must surely find increase of joy in this pinion frond, when any man thirsts for it in his mind." There's this balance between calling out for divine help and this great description of his great powers of poetry, and how he's going to receive great glory and honor from all of this, and how the reward is going to be so great. He's going to receive these laurels that almost no one ever gets, and everyone should strain for. We're going to continue this idea a little bit more in the next canto. So as we left off at the end of Purgatorio, we were in earthly paradise in the Garden of Eden, on top of the Mount Purgatory, and there with Beatrice, Dante had been cleansed of his former sin by drinking from Lethe, and then he had drunk from Inoue, which reminded him of his goodness, and so now he's been purged and he's been cleansed, and he's ready to ascend to the stars. That's the close of Purgatorio, right? And so here, he's standing with Beatrice, and she looks to the sun. I saw Beatrice had turned left to raise her eyes up to the sun. No eagle ever stared in its shining with so fixed a gaze. And as a ray descending from the sky gives rise to another which climbs back again, as a pilgrim yearns for home, so through my eye her action, like a ray into my mind, gave rise to mine. I stared into the sun, so hard that here it would have left me blind. But much is granted to our senses there, in that garden made to be man's proper place, that is not granted us when we are here. So he stared into the sun, which is not something you should do or can do here on Earth, but because he was part of the earthly paradise already, he was possible. And so, in a moment, suddenly, he is lifting up and flying through the air. And he doesn't even realize it at first. He suddenly discovers that he is soaring through the air. At first, it just seems like the sun is getting brighter, but then he realizes it's because he's flying up. And I find it interesting that he opens with this sense that he cannot describe everything, that not everything in heaven is going to be able to be described. He said that same sort of thing with Apollo, talking about how he's only going to be able to describe a shadow of this heavenly kingdom. Also here he says this sense of being translated up into heaven. How can I describe this change to human senses? It's impossible. And so he makes this comparison to Glaucus, who ate an herb and became transformed. Dante is amazed by all of this, and similar to other times, Beatrice explains it to him without him actually having to ask. He says he sees how the radiance is just sort of surrounding him, and when she looks and saw his perplexity, before I asked my question, she had started her reply. Thus she began, "You dull your own perceptions with false imaginings, and do not grasp what would be clear, but for your preconceptions. You think you are still on earth. The lightning spear never fled downward from its natural place as rapidly as you are rising here." So he thinks he's still on Earth, but he's just like everything around him is getting super bright, but then he realizes that he's been lifted up. The reason for this is that he is so light that he can soar towards heaven. And this idea was explored a lot in Purgatorio, right? As he passed each cornice of Purgatorio, he was cleansed of one of the sins, one of the P's was removed from his forehead, and he felt lighter and more capable of climbing after each section. At first it was very hard, but with each cleansing he was able to go higher and higher. Until finally, when he gets to the top, he's completely light, and he's so light that he can soar into heaven without even feeling it. Dante is still amazed by this, but Beatrice goes on to explain that even though he's still physical and still has an earthly body, this purification has left him so light, and that when you are completely pure, you are so light that it is easy, in fact, it is necessary to ascend into heaven. And if you were to fall back to earth, that would be the strange thing. Flying is not so strange when you're clean. If you, free as you are of every dross, had settled and come to rest below, that would indeed have been as marvelous as a still flame there in the mortal plane. So saying, we move past our introduction and fly on to Canto 2, where we land on the moon! It's the first stage in our series Through the Stars. And by stars, we're talking about, like, everything up there. Dante's going to visit several different planets and fixed bodies, and then the fixed stars, and then ultimately the Empyrean. And on each step of the journey, we're going to explore a different idea. So each of these places represents a different kind of heavenly aspect. It's a heaven for a particular kind of people. And that's going to lead to some confusion here in just a moment, but it's going to be explained for us. Dante starts Canto 2 with sort of a call out to his readers and a warning that this is going to be heavy going. "Oh, you who in your wish to hear these things have followed thus far in your little skiffs, the wake of my great ship that sails and sings, turn back and make your way to your own coast." In other words, if you've been gliding along with your little boats behind my giant ship of thought, then you might want to turn back here because it's going to get really difficult. And he describes like going out into the ocean in a little bitty rowboat, and you're trying to follow this huge steamship and it's not working because you're in a tiny little boat and you can't do it. And the storms will knock you over and drown you, as opposed to the giant ships that will protect you. This is kind of interesting because if we could make comparison with Purgatorio. At the very beginning of Purgatorio, he talks about his little bark. And he's come this far in, like, basically a canoe. And now he's talking about his thought and his journey as a giant ship. And all you little people behind there in your little canoes, you better watch out, because you can't follow me. Do not commit yourself to the main deep, for losing me, all may perhaps be lost. My course is set for an uncharted sea. Minerva fills my sail, Apollo steers, and the 9 new muses point the pole for me. You other few who have set yourselves to eat the bread of angels by which we live on earth, but of which no man ever grew replete, you may well trust your keel to the salt tack, and follow in the furrow of my wake ahead of the parted waters that close back. So even those of you who are, really into spiritual, theological things deep enough that you think you can make this journey with me, sure, you can come along, but you better follow in my furrows. You better, stay in my wake, stay close, so that you don't get lost in the big wide sea of theology that I'm about to take you on. Again, it just has that sort of balance between that divine guidance, which he mentions in Apollo and Minerva and the Muses, and also this sense of pride. I mean, he's calling himself, the great ship of thought, and nobody else can follow me, nobody else can go where I go. Reminds us a lot of some of the other things we've seen in, Inferno, for instance. Okay, so they fly up and they land in this new place. And Dante says, I found myself in a place where a wondrous thing drew my entire attention, whereat she, from whom I could not hide my mind's least yearning, turned to me and said, as much in joy as beauty. To God, who has raised us now to the first star, direct your thoughts in glad and grateful duty. It seemed to me a cloud as luminous and dense and smoothly polished as a diamond, struck by a ray of sun, enveloped us. We were received into the elements of the eternal pearl as water takes light to itself with no change in its substance. And so he describes this location as being completely smooth and like a pearl. And this is pretty interesting because he's on the surface of the moon, which, as we can clearly see from Earth, is not smooth as a pearl. It's got all these, craters in it. So Dante spends the rest of this canto explaining why the moon looks craterous from the earth and why it's really not. Dante asks the question to Beatrice, saying, my lady, in every way my being can, I offer up my thanks to him who raised me from the world of clay. But tell me, what dark traces in the grain of this bright body show themselves below and cause men to tell fables about Cain? So why are there these marks on the moon if it is so smooth? And like a good teacher, instead of just telling him the answer, she says, well, what do you believe? What do you think? And he says that these variations we observe are caused by bodies of varying density. So let's get logical about this. There's probably varying density on the moon, and so when it shines down on us, some places are thicker than others, and so they shine a little darker. And she says, nope, sorry. And she goes on to explain all of this and to undermine his thought about density with a series of interesting thought. It starts with a scientific exploration of the idea, in which she points out ways you can perform experiments here on Earth to disprove his thought, and moves on into this mystical idea about the nature of God and the divine. So after pointing out logically and reasonably that it cannot be about density, she goes on to explain it in more spiritual terms, which is, again, the idea that we saw a lot in Purgatorio. We're moving away from physical things and moving on to spiritual things. Reason no longer has bounds over us. I mean, remember how we left Virgil behind, and now we are moving on into more spiritual kind of ideas, which is why, again, Dante, when he talks about the ship at the beginning of this canto, says, hey, you can only follow me here if you have a decent enough exploration and grasp of theology. As the soul within your mortal clay is spread throughout different organs, each of which is shaped to its own end, in the same way the high angelic intelligence spreads its goodness, diversified through all the many stars, while yet revolving ever in its oneness. This varying power is variously infused throughout the precious body that it quickens, in which, like life in you, it is diffused. Because of the glad nature from which it flows, this many-faceted power shines through that body, as through the living eye the glad soul glows. From this source only, not from the rare and the dense, comes that by which one light and another differs, the formal principle, whose excellence, conforming to its own purposes, makes appear those markings you observe as dark and clear. This light comes from the divine, it comes from above, and therefore it can shine variously where it chooses and where it deems worthy. Sort of almost feels like a cop-out answer. I mean, oh, it's just shining on you like that because it just shines on the moon like that because that's the way God wants it to. I mean, it's kind of a simple answer as opposed to the scientific answer that Dante was seeking after. But it does go on to help us understand the symbolism of the moon and the way the characters who we meet on the souls that we meet on the moon are being represented. They are inconstant, as the moon is inconstant. I mean, the moon is always a symbol for inconstancy. I mean, after all, it changes, it goes through cycles. I'm getting weird, patches of light on my face. Okay, so Dante has had his explanation from Beatrice, moving us on into Canto 3, and he looks up to her to say, I got it, but he's distracted by what he sees next. I, raising my eyes to her eyes, to announce myself resolved of error and well assured, was about to speak, but before I could pronounce my first word, there appeared to me a vision. It seized and held me so that I forgot to offer her my thanks and my confession. And he sees these faces, these visions of these souls who are coming ready, but they look like reflections. They don't look like the real thing. They're faint and shadowy. And so his first thought is that they are reflections, and he turns around to look behind him to see where the true souls are, where the true bodies are. So similar to the way that the concept of the moon, where it appears to have different levels of light on it, these craterous images, and yet does not, is smooth, these souls appear to be simply shadows and impressions, but yet they are the true souls. Thinking the pale traces I saw there were reflected images, I turned round to face the source, but my eyes met empty air. I turned around again like one beguiled and took my line of sight from my sweet guide, whose sacred eyes grew radiant as she smiled. It's important to point out, as Dante makes mistakes in Paradise, that these mistakes are simply intellectual mistakes and not necessarily sinful kinds of mistakes. He isn't going into dangerous error, and anytime that he has a question about something, Beatrice will explain it to keep him from error. But all of these are sort of ways that the natural logical reason and the ideas of poetry cannot carry him all the way. They do not carry him all the way to the theological aspects, and so he has to be supported and helped along the way. And she laughs at him for being stupid. "Are you surprised that I smile at this childish act of reasoning?" she said, "since even now you dare not trust your senses of the true fact, but turn as usual back to vacancy. These are the true substances you see before you. They are assigned here for inconstancy, to holy vows." So these souls here are here on the moon because of their inconstancy, because they broke a vow to God. So they had a vow that they were giving to God, and in some way they undid it. All the souls we're going to meet are going to be nuns who forsook their vow of chastity and became married instead of staying nuns. But presumably any vow you break would get you to the moon. And Beatrice says, "Talk to these souls because the true light that fills them permits no soul to wander from its rays." They're going to tell you the truth. Whatever they say, you can believe, unlike the souls in Inferno, who are always manipulating the truth, and unlike even the souls in Purgatorio, who are at times still tainted by falsehood and still tainted by their own desires. These souls are going to speak the absolute truth. Here we are in heaven. And it's going to be interesting because something that's said in the next couple cantos is going to contradict what one of the souls say here, and Beatrice is going to have to explain that, and explain how both of them were speaking truth, but just about a slightly different topic. And here he meets a pair of souls, just like we've seen pairs of souls all the way through the Divine Comedy, down in Inferno, in Purgatorio. Again, we meet a pair of souls, and this pair is Picarda and Constance. As I said, both of these were nuns who forsook their vow, and yet the forsaking is kind of problematic, and we're going to see that in the next canto. Both of them forsook their holy vows, not because they wanted to, but because they were dragged away by members of their family and forced to marry against their will. And as Picarda describes Constance, who is silent, as we see a lot of times in the pairs, against her will and all propriety she was forced back to the world, yet even there her heart was ever veiled in sanctity. So even though she was dragged away from her vow and forced to marry against her will, her heart was ever veiled. That means her heart was ever still in her vow and to her vow. So she forsook her vow completely against her will, and her heart was still completely willed towards the good. So if you remember in Inferno and in Purgatorio, we've talked a lot about the idea of will, and how will is often the difference between an act of good and an act of evil. When Dante was down talking about the Simonists, he's talking about abuse of holy things, and he describes these people who abuse holy things and how awful it is, how these people were set on power and gain and themselves, and Dante describes his own action breaking a baptistry, which seems like an abuse of something holy, but he describes it as innocent and pure because he did it to save someone else's life. So he's exonerated and they're condemned. Here these souls, completely against their will, were forced into this, and they lost the greater glory that they could have received. How is that fair? Dante's going to explore that idea in just a moment. But also, Dante also has a question about whether these souls can really be happy. I mean, here you are in heaven, but you're like on the lowest level of heaven. I'm only on the moon. Oh, bummer. And I mean, don't you want more? Don't you sit here and think, man, I could have been all the way there at the Empyrean. Man, why am I not good enough? Here I am on the lowest level. And he asks this of Picarda, and she explains. She smiled, as did the spirits at her side, and turning to me with such joy, she seemed to burn with the first fire of love, replied, "Brother, the power of love, which is our bliss, calms all our will. What we desire we have. There is in us no other thirst than this." And so, because they are in accordance with God's will and with God's desire, this is what's right, this is what's true, therefore we are happy in it. So they find joy in their position, even if it's not the greatest position, because it's the right place for them. And she goes on to this long explanation of divine will, and how divine will helps to straighten out our will, and it gives us peace. In his will is our peace. It is that sea to which all moves, all that itself creates and nature bears through all eternity. So everything is fine as long as it is in accordance with divine will. And so here we see again the submission of my will to divine will, and that makes everything work out. And it even makes it good that I'm not in the highest level of heaven. I also think it's interesting, as Charty's notes pointed out to me, that the souls here aren't merely seen by Dante, but that they present themselves to him. They appear to Dante. This other splendor who lets herself appear here to my right to please you. Because everything in the divine world and in the world of paradise is actually presented to him. It is given to him, not simply discovered by him. It has to be revealed to us by heaven. As Constance and Picarda move on with the rest of the souls, Dante turns to Beatrice, and she's so blindingly beautiful that he's overwhelmed. But she flashed so radiantly upon my sight that I, at first, was blinded, and thus was slow to ask her what I wished to know. We're going to see that Beatrice, as she continues up through heaven and grows closer and closer to the ultimate divine love, she's going to become more and more beautiful, and she's going to reflect more and more brightly the radiance of divine love, which is going to be kind of intense for Dante, especially given that his first glance at her in Purgatory just kind of like melted his mind. So Dante opens in Canto 4 with attempting to ask Beatrice these pressing questions upon him. Two of them. The first one is, okay, so how is it fair that souls who did not will their breaking of the vow can actually be punished for it, or at least not held responsible for it, And two, his second question is, okay, so how come the souls go to these set places? There's Plato's theory that souls come from the stars and then they return to the stars, and therefore they sort of go back to where they were, in which case, you know, hey, if where we're going is already predetermined, how do we have any choice in the matter? How is this fair? And Beatrice is going to explain both these ideas. But before she does, Dante actually has trouble asking the questions because he's caught between two equal choices. This question is really pressing upon me, and this question is really pressing upon me. In fact, they're pressing equally upon me, and therefore I can't make up my mind which one to ask first, and so he's stuck. Just as a dog between two bones, as the old story goes. And because both look equally good, he can't make up his mind which one he should take. He has no choice anymore. His choice is so equally weighted that there is no will left to him. It's an interesting idea, and playing with the idea of free will. So if I'm trapped between two equal choices, I don't really have will here, do I? And so finally, Beatrice has to make the choice for him. And she sees a difference between the two questions. The first question about how it's fair is not as significant a question as the whole idea of challenging free will and returning to the stars. That's a question that has to do with the doctrine of free will, and therefore is heretical if Dante keeps going down that way. So she addresses that first and says, okay, it may appear that the souls are going to a specific location, like the moon, or these other locations we're going to visit, but this is all actually kind of just for show for you. And all of this is presented to you so that you can understand. So Dante sees these souls on the moon not because they are fixed to the moon. In fact, all souls are surrounding God. But they have descended down here, or presented themselves to Dante here, so that he can better understand, so his human reasoning can grasp it all. And so we're going to see that the souls are all surrounding God and are all basking in his light, although some slightly less than others. But it's not going to be so divided up as it appears here. Second, she addresses the question of whether Picarda and Constance, who did not will their breaking of vows, can really be held responsible for it. Time and again, my brother, men have run from danger by a path they would not choose, and on it done what they ought not be done. Now weigh within your own intelligence how will and violence interact, so joining that no excuse can wipe out the offense. If violence to begin occurs when those who suffer its abuse contribute nothing to what forces them, then these souls have no claim to that excuse. For the will, if it will not, cannot be spent, but does as nature does within a flame, 1,000 or 10,000 winds have bent. If it yields of itself, even in the least, then it assists the violence, as did these who could have gone back to their holy feast. So, Beatrice points out that these souls who were forced to marry against their will and break their holy vows, if everything was absolutely 100% forced, cannot be held responsible for it. But because they continued in their married life instead of physically fleeing when they had the opportunity and running away, they didn't fight every bit all the way for the rest of their lives. So yeah, they're held responsible. Now that's a pretty heavy call. If I'm dragged away by force, but I don't fight eternally against that, then I am in some ways complicit with it. It reminds me a lot of one of the Chronicles of Narnia. In the story of Prince Caspian, Lucy sees Aslan. She sees the lion, and her brothers and sister and the dwarf, they don't. And so Lucy sees that Aslan wants them to go this way, but everyone else wants to go that way. And so she argues, and she says, I see Aslan, he wants us to go that way, I think we should go that way. They put it up to a vote, everyone votes the other way. And it doesn't work out for them in the end. But Lucy says, oh, I want to go that way, and she winds up going with them weeping. And we all feel bad for Lucy because we know she's right. But she accepts the correction of her brother and her older sister, and she goes with them. In the end, she is corrected and chastised a bit because she could have left them. She could have gone on her own, although that seems like a really ridiculous idea. She could have continued to hold on to her will and onto her side, even if the others did not go with her. And so these souls here were also offered that choice. They did not completely 100% fight against the violence, and they had to go along with it a little bit. So they're here, they were forced married to some people. They didn't run away from that marriage. They didn't fight against it tooth and claw. Therefore, they are to some extent complicit with it, even if in their hearts they still desired the veil. And so again, even though Constance had her heart veiled, according to Picarda, Beatrice points out that there's a difference between that the two kinds of will here. There's that will that desires something, but then there's also the will that actually forces you to do it. Because they didn't fight completely against it, they actually have some responsibility in it. And so that's pretty heavy. You have to completely not just want to do something, but you have to keep working for it, and you can't stop. You can't ever stop. But Dante suddenly comes to another question which he wants to pose to Beatrice, and I'm going to follow through his answer, which leads into Canto 5, but just look at the first half of Canto 5 here. Beatrice looked at me, and with her glad eyes, afire with their divinity, shot forth such sparks of love that my poor faculties gave up the reins, and with my eyes cast down I stood entranced, my senses all but flown. By this am I encouraged, by this bidden, my lady, in all reverence to ask your guidance to a truth that still lies hidden. Can such as these, who put away their veils, so compensate by their good works done that they be not found wanting in your scales? So is it possible, after doing wrong, after making a mistake, particularly after breaking a vow, to undo that, to do so much good on the other side that it outweighs this vow breaking? Is it possible to overcome this sin and not be found wanting? And Beatrice is going to answer that in Canto 5. She appears more beautiful as they are continuing to ascend to the next sphere, and so because of that, she has to explain how she's going to continue to grow more beautiful each step of the journey. If in warmth of love I manifest more of my radiance than the world can see, rendering your eyes unequal to the test, do not be amazed. These are the radiances of the perfected vision that sees the good and step by step moves nearer what it sees. And she moves on without stop to explain Dante's question. Of all creation's bounty, realize God's greatest gift, the gift in which mankind is most like him. The gift by him most prized is the freedom he bestows upon the will. So free will is the most powerful and wonderful gift of God, the ability to choose, the ability to will and to decide and to make our own decisions. That's the greatest gift from God, according to Beatrice here. And so, because that is our greatest gift, if we give that up by making a vow, A vow would be submitting our will to his will. I vow that I will do as you want me to, God. And so that vow is giving up my will to him. Since I have returned that will, how can I make up for that, she says. When therefore God and man have sealed the pact, the man divests himself of that great treasure of which I speak, by his own free act. What can you offer then to make amends? How can you make good use of what is his? Would you employ extortion to good ends? So there's really no way to make up for a broken vow. Sorry, Picarda. Sorry, Constance. Sorry for all you vow breakers out there. You can't come back from that and come out good. She goes on to explain a few possibilities. There is the exception that if you break a vow that has a specific worth and value, and you can replace it by something even more valuable, that's a possibility in substituting a separate item for the vow. And she ties that back into Levitical sacrifices in the Old Testament. The idea that if somebody could not submit this particular object, it could submit the second animal for sacrifice, which was more valuable. So you can't ever go ahead and just completely be free from a vow. You have to submit it. She does, however, point out about evil vows and rash vows, how certain vows should not be honored, like Jephthah's vow, where he vowed to kill his own daughter. He vowed to kill whatever came out of his house after his victory, and he comes home, and who comes out of his house? He thought it would be a goat? No, it's his daughter. And so he's really horrified by that. And instead of keeping that vow and killing his daughter, he should have said, "Oh, that was a terrible idea. I'm so sorry, that vow was wrong." Then at least he's only responsible for the rash vow that he spoke and not for the worst sin of murdering his daughter. Every time you make a vow, you have to take it super seriously. She talks about not being rash. She says, "Be slow to move, Christians. Be grave, serene. Do not be like a feather in the wind, nor think that every water washes clean." So that was a whole lot of ideas that we got in our very first section, in the moon. We got the idea that although these souls are presented in these different areas, they aren't actually here. We got a lot of discussion of free will and the idea that complete will and perfect will, absolute will, is a little bit more complicated than simply desiring it. We'll continue on into the next two spheres in the next section. Thanks so much for watching. Thanks, Harrison, for all of your great notes, and I'll see you all when I return from vacation.